Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome you all back to my 500 movies in 2025 series. And for this episode, this will be movies number 433 through 442. And here we are at the end of November. It is November 30th, 2025, and we are just a few days removed from what was Thanksgiving. And while I'm a little late putting out the Thanksgiving special, well, better late than never, as I always say. So I wanted to just finish out this month, it being the last day of November this year, by doing this CraterMania Thanksgiving special, where I'm going to be talking about several different movies around the Thanksgiving holiday that I have grew up loving over the years, and a few that I had never seen before, and this was my first time watching them. So, and a lot of these are I'm going to be talking about are very special movies to me, especially from my childhood growing up. And not only are they special to me, they're special to so many people that loves movies, including people from my family, like my son and my wife and my brother-in-law. Just so many people, and my mom and dad love some of these movies. I remember watching several of these with them growing up. Um, and I'm just so excited to talk about these things because Thanksgiving is really an underrated holiday, and people love, like me. My favorite holiday is Halloween. My wife Candace's favorite holiday is Christmas. You know, those are two of the biggest popular holidays that there is in the United States. Um, but Thanksgiving, I feel like, is so underrated just because, a lot of people, don't get me wrong, a lot of people love Thanksgiving, because it's a time that they get to come together with their family and give thanks for everything that they're thankful for, and they get to have a huge smorgasbord of food. Um, and that's one of my favorite reasons when it comes to Thanksgiving is like I love getting all the food and getting the family together. Like this year we had Thanksgiving at my brother-in-law's apartment, and we all the family was there, and just it's a really really good time. We had tons and tons of great food, but like I said, it's a very underrated holiday, but it just seems like there is so many, movies out there that's kind of surrounding the holiday, especially like comedy films and horror films. And we're going to talk about several of those tonight. So, um, let me go ahead and just jump right into this. So, with this first movie, when you think of Thanksgiving, there are several hallmarks around, the crisp autumn air, the scent of roasting turkey, just that warmth, like I was talking about, just a family gathered around a table. Like I said, those are all like hallmarks of Thanksgiving when you think of it. Um, Now, when it comes to Thanksgiving movies, and if you're a horror fan like me, the holiday can sometimes conjure these images of, shadowy figures, chilling screams, just that ever present threat of something, far more sinister lurking beyond that festive glow of the holiday. So, enter this first movie we're going to talk about, Home Sweet Home from 1981. This is a movie that takes just that cozy idea of, the American tradition and just kind of douses it in this, generous helping of PCP fueled madness. So for, a seasoned horror fan, especially myself, this 1981 slasher offers a very unique, although flawed, slice of that holiday themed terror. Um, so this movie, Home Sweet Home, which is also known by the less descriptive and but equally menacing title, Slasher in the House, is definitely a product of its time. It's a slasher film that unapologetically just embraces the themes of the genre while attempting to kind of inject a bit of that seasonal flavor. Um, this was directed by Nettie Pena, and it was also written by Thomas Bush. And the movie's premise is pretty straightforward. So on Thanksgiving night, this family, and their guests are targeted by this guy, this killer on the loose named Jay Jones. He's an escaped mental patient who has had this addiction uh, to PCP, and obviously he also has this addiction to brutality. So the the story kicks off with all this gratuitous violence, just establishing Jay as a formidable and just unpredictable threat. He's a force of nature, a primal scream against just the domestic tranquility that Thanksgiving often represents. Um, so the movie kind of bravely positions itself as one of the rare slasher entries to embrace the Thanksgiving holiday. Which is a club that also includes the cult favorite Blood Rage, and later the movie from Eli Roth, Thanksgiving, which we'll also be talking about both of those movies later on in this episode. Um, so a notable aspect of Home Sweet Home is its direction, by this woman, Nettie Pena, which at the time was a rarity in that kind of dominant male, slasher landscape of the early 1980s. Um, so this kind of distinction, really adds this interesting layer, to the movie's legacy. Though its impact on the the film's kind of stylistic choices isn't immediately obvious. Um, the film's kind of notoriety also extends to its entanglement with the whole video nasty panic in the UK, where it was infamously seized under the Obscene Publications Act, which I think that's a testament to its kind of visceral and confrontational nature for that era. um, so with Home Sweet Home, the story itself unfolds with this predictable but effective rhythm. Um, you have this idyllic Thanksgiving gathering at Harold Bradley's ranch, and it serves as this perfect backdrop for Jay Jones's descent into mayhem. And the guest list is kind of a who's who of those potential victims. You got Harold's girlfriend Linda, his tenant Scott, and his partner Jennifer. You got Linda's friend Gail. Harold's associate Wayne, and his girlfriend Maria. And then you have Harold's son, which his name is Mistake, and he seems like he's a Kiss Army devotee. He's a Kiss fan. It seems like, because he's kind of which he's got that white, like looking almost mime like makeup on. He's always carrying around his guitar. Just kind of adds this touch of quirky characterization to him. And then you have the young little girl Angel. So this escalating violence is just this kind of steady, drip of dread, just and Jay systematically, disables this household, plunging it into darkness and just then picking off these inhabitants, one by one. And the movie doesn't shy away, from graphic kills, from the skull crushing demise of Harold to just that brutal head slamming of Gail. The scene where Jay, takes Wayne, he destroys Wayne pretty much, I should say, in his own car is a classic slasher moment. Just exploiting just the vulnerability, of a seemingly safe space. And the confrontation between Jay and Linda, ending with her death by this broken bottle is particularly unsettling, and it highlights that kind of desperate measure um, that's taken by these victims, and just all these gruesome events was just the image of the family sitting down to this turkey dinner is it's kind of an effective, very dark touch. Um, and the escalating tension as Jay, infiltrates the house and confronts these survivors, notably, the struggle with Scott and Jennifer, it just kind of builds toward this, frantic climax. And Jennifer's, resilience and wounding Jay, and followed by his brutal, revenge on Scott, just showcases the commitment to this high body count and just a relentless pursuit. And then you have the arrival of the police, just ultimately dispatching Jay with a shotgun. It just provides this kind of seemingly cathartic resolution, but the final shot of Jay's eyes opening leaves this kind of lingering sense of unease, and it's a classic horror ending that kind of just that whispers of this unfinished business. But as time will tell, we never got a sequel to Home Sweet Home. Um, but so I should say, the legacy and the impact of Home Sweet Home as a singular slasher film that did not become a franchise is still multifaceted. For slasher fans, it holds this place as kind of a niche holiday entry that, while perhaps not reaching the heights of genre titans like Halloween or Friday the 13th, or even My Bloody Valentine, it still offers this kind of solid dose of of gore and suspense, and its status as a video nasty cemented its reputation as this controversial and this transgressive film. And it appeals to those that are drawn to that extreme horror, I think. And for its cast, it represents this early role for Vanessa Shaw, who would go on to have a more prominent career. um and just the movie's exploration of this escaped mental patient as a killer just kind of taps into those primal fears of just the unpredictable and just that breakdown of of society, and the order in society, just it's, which is, I think, is a common theme in slasher movies. However, its impact is also tempered by its flaws. Um, the pacing can be a little uneven, and some of the characterizations are very thin. Yet, and I think in this unpretentious approach, to carnage and just its dedication to this Thanksgiving theme, Home Sweet Home really kind of carves out, its own unique bloody niche, I think, in the horror community. Um, but in conclusion, Home Sweet Home is just a Thanksgiving horror movie that, while not perfect, it still delivers this, I think, a satisfyingly gory and tension filled experience for, the diehard slasher fan. Um, I think it really embraces just that holiday setting with this dark kind of twisted humor and just relentless killing spree that just despite all of its rough edges, really still makes for this kind of memorable watch. And it's one that I've watched many times over the years. I think it's a film that reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying things can happen when you invite strangers into your home, or when they simply decide to just break in. Um, so definitely take the time, and just brace yourself for a Thanksgiving that's anything but sweet with Home Sweet Home. Check it out if you can. I believe the full movie is on YouTube for free if you guys want to go watch it. Um, but definitely check it out. Let me know what you think. But one of the next movie I want to talk about is one of the movies that I mentioned earlier. Um, and like I said, when it comes to holiday themed horror, Halloween and Christmas, they get a lot of the love when it comes, to horror movies based around holidays. And again, Thanksgiving is kind of surprisingly a barren landscape for horror, especially slashers. So it kind of often leaves genre fans scrambling for something to watch, besides a parade. Uh, so then we have Blood Rage, which is this gloriously unhinged 1987 slasher, that more than makes up for the holidays kind of sparse, offerings. Um, it's not just a Thanksgiving horror movie. I think it's one of those, it's one of those 80s slashers that just really stands out. It's a bloody, bizarre, and honestly, utterly unforgettable train wreck that has kind of rightfully carved its place, as a cult classic. Um, so, for those of you who like their turkey served with a side of carnage, then Blood Rage may be the main course for you. Um, so Blood Rage is this classic evil twin slasher. It's a setup that's as simple, as it is effective. Um, the movie opens at this drive-in in 1974, and where we see young Terry. He's disturbed by his mother's romantic escapades, just brutally murders a couple with a hatchet, and he pins the crime on his twin brother Todd. 10 years later, on Thanksgiving Day, the family's fragile peace is shattered. So Maddie, the boys' mother, who is played with this just kind of delirious, campy brilliance by Louise Lasser, is about to marry her new fiance. And meanwhile, the real killer, Terry, has been living, this normal life while the innocent Todd, escapes the asylum, and he's heading home to confront his past. So this holiday reunion ignites Terry's kind of homicidal fury, and he embarks on this this killing spree just through this secluded apartment complex, all while intending to just to frame his escaped twin once again. Um, so the stage is set, for this night of mayhem, mistaken identities, and just some of the most definitely memorable kills of that you will see in a Thanksgiving horror film. Um, so the legacy and the impact of Blood Rage is kind of twofold, stemming from like just that outrageous gore and just the wonderfully strange performances. Um, it was filmed in 1983, but it was shelved, for years, and it was eventually released in this kind of heavily censored version titled Nightmare at Shadow Woods. Um, so this cut really neutered the film's greatest asset, which was its incredible practical effects. Um, so the true cult status of the film was born from the uncut version, which was released, on home video as Blood Rage. And it showcases just that special effects artistry, in all its gruesome glory. Um, we see a man, cleft in two, a head lopped off with a machete, a woman literally, sawn in half. It's a nonstop barrage of just viscera that stands, shoulder to shoulder with some of the goriest slashers, I think, of the era. Um, and beyond the bloodshed, the film is legendary for its kind of surreal atmosphere. Just driven primarily by Louise Lasser's unhinged performance as Maddie, and her descent into this kind of frantic, booze fueled panic is really a sight to behold. And it culminates in this very tragic and hysterical climax. Um, so Mark Soper, who plays the dual role of Terry and Todd, also deserves immense credit for his that dual role, um, just because he's perfectly just capturing Todd's traumatized innocence, and then Terry's kind of chillingly casual being this casual sociopath. And so you have Terry's gleeful, delivery of the film's probably its most iconic line. That's not cranberry sauce. After this kill, just perfectly kind of encapsulates the movie's, dark, and almost comedic tone. Um, so this combination of just extreme violence and bizarre, over the top acting is really what the appeal is, and what elevates Blood Rage from this forgotten slasher to this almost beloved cult artifact. You know, so and with its modern resurgence, thanks to this beautiful restoration by Arrow Films, has really allowed a newer generation of horror fans to appreciate its kind of mad genius in all of its fully uncensored glory. Um, but in conclusion, Blood Rage is not a movie that's for the faint of heart or for those seeking that high art of cinema. It's a messy, poorly paced, sometimes nonsensical B movie. Um, but I think for the dedicated horror fan, especially slasher fans, all those kind of flaws are really part of its charm. Um, and unless you're a slasher fan, you really won't understand that. Um, I think it's a perfect time capsule of that 80s slasher excess. It delivers everything that the genre promises. Creative kills, a memorable killer for sure, um, and this holiday setting that's kind of twisted into this backdrop for terror. Um, to me, it's one of those definitive Thanksgiving horror movies. It's just a chaotic, bloody feast that is as satisfyingly trashy as it is endlessly rewatchable. Um, so if you're looking to add a little mayhem to your holiday menu this year, you can't go wrong with Blood Rage. Uh, I I highly recommend it. And some of you listening may be a little bit confused by that after you watch the film, but like I said, you just got to be a huge slasher fan to kind of fully understand where I'm coming from. Um, but to move on, for just a little bit from the horror genre, let's step into the comedy genre, and let's talk about one of the greatest thanks, if not the greatest Thanksgiving movie of all time. Because you see, there are Christmas movies by the dozen, and a very healthy supply of Halloween flicks. But again, like I said, the whole cinematic landscape for Thanksgiving is very short. But as I said, with this movie and me considering it possibly the greatest Thanksgiving movie of all time, and for millions of people out there that definitely probably share, that same opinion, Thanksgiving isn't complete without this one film. And this is John Hughes's 1987 masterpiece, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. So I've been a fan of this movie for a very, very long time. And just I've been a fan of comedy like my entire life. And I've been a huge fan of both Steve Martin and John Candy. And this film is not just a holiday tradition, it is a perfect storm of comedic genius, the impeccable chemistry between Steve Martin and John Candy, and it just has a lot of that profound, unexpected heart. Um, it's a film that proves that you know these road trip journeys can lead to the most rewarding destination. Um, So let's talk about the ultimate road trip from hell movie. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is a deceptively simple story, of this one man's desperate 3-day odyssey to get home for Thanksgiving to his family. And that man is Neil Page, played by Steve Martin. And Neil is this polished, high-strung advertising executive who views the world with this kind of simmering impatience. And after this frustrating business meeting in New York, all he wants is to get back to his family in Chicago. But fate, in the form of this looming blizzard and this portly, endlessly cheerful shower curtain ring salesman named Dale Griffith, played by John Candy, has other plans for Neil. So, what follows is this symphony of disaster. That's the best way I could put it. Um, from a stolen cab to a diverted flight to Wichita, Kansas, Neil is forced into this unwilling partnership with Dale, a man who is his polar opposite. Um, so where Neil is cynical and reserved, Dale is an open book. He's clumsy and just eternally optimistic, and just even when things go spectacularly wrong. So they're kind of they're forced partnership here. You know, ends up in this single motel room, featuring that iconic moment where he says, "Those aren't pillows." And if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. And it just all that sets the stage for this brilliant comedic rhythm between the two. Um, and director John Hughes, who's fresh off the string of iconic teen comedies, just masterfully crafts this series of these escalating calamities that are both hilarious and just painfully relatable to anyone who has ever had to suffer through holiday travel. Um, this a broken down train leaves them stranded in a frozen field. A bus ride is cramped and uncomfortable, and then there's the rental car. The sequence beginning at the marathon rental car counter where Neil unleashes this legendary f-bomb tirade on you know this unhelpful agent, played by Eddie McClurg, is just a masterclass in just comedic frustration. It's a very cathartic release for every traveler who has ever been pushed, to their breaking point. And this sequence leads to one of the most memorable scenes in comedy history, which, if you've seen the thumbnail for this video, that image of John Candy um, dressed up as the devil, in just as a kind of a hallucination for Neil, um, is part of this moment in the movie. It's part of this scene. So you have Dale driving the wrong way down the highway. And all this is illuminated by these oncoming headlights, and culminating in their rental car becoming this smoldering skeletal wreck. And is, like I said, is the to me, it's the best part in the entire movie, or at least the funniest part in the entire movie. There's a lot of really good moments, so it's hard to pinpoint what the best moment is in the entire movie. The ending's pretty great too, pretty emotional. Um, but the genius of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles isn't just in its slapstick or the witty dialogue, but it's in that profound humanity that underpins every chaotic scene. um and the film's legacy really rests on like three pillars here. So it's perfect blend of comedy and drama. It's place as the definitive Thanksgiving movie, and just that the career defining performances of Steve Martin and John Candy. um, John Hughes proved with this film that his talent for capturing authentic human emotion, extended far beyond the hallways of a high school. Um, the turning point really comes in that first shared motel room. After Neil cruelly unloads on Dale, criticizing his chattiness and his habits. Dale's kind of cheerful facade starts to crack. And in this kind of moment of quiet dignity, he responds, "I like me. My wife likes me." And it's a gut punch that instantly transforms Dale from this kind of bumbling caricature, into this lonely, vulnerable human being. Um, and from that moment on, the film is no longer just about these two mismatched travelers. It's about Neil's journey from selfish annoyance to this kind of genuine empathy. Um, and that's what I love about this movie and just John Hughes films in general. There's always this like very um, important message he's always trying to get across, to try to make us the viewers who may have these same flaws as these characters, or these you know these insecurities or whatever they may be, to try to help us be better people. And I think that's what makes John Hughes one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. Um, the way he's able to display emotion through his films and his characters and his stories. Um, but this journey, that we see in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is really what cements the film as, I think, the ultimate Thanksgiving classic. It perfectly captures, that stress and that misery of holiday travel, but more importantly, it embodies just, the holiday's true spirit. You know, it's a story about gratitude and compassion and just that realization that family can be found in the most unexpected of places. And the final act in this film, where Neil pieces together the truth about Dale's life, that his beloved wife Marie had passed away years ago, and he has no home to go to, is, I think, one of the most powerful and heartwarming reveals um, for any 80s movie, or just really any movie in general. Neil's decision to bring Dale home to his own Thanksgiving dinner is that perfect emotional crescendo. A testament to just the connection forged in this shared nightmare that Dale and Neil have had to endure. Um, so the impact of the film is also inseparable from its stars. For Steve Martin, it was a showcase for his incredible gifts. You know, um, and just his slow burn, frustration, punctuated by volcanic explosions of rage, is both hysterical and just deeply relatable. Um, but this is possibly John Candy's finest hour in his career. He imbues Dale Griffith with this boundless warmth and just a deep seated loneliness that is, utterly captivating. He is annoying, yes, but he is also resilient and, profoundly decent. It is a performance of such nuance and heart that it's impossible to imagine anyone else, in that role. Um, but more than 3 decades after this movie's release, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles remains a to me a flawless piece of filmmaking. It's kind of that cinematic, comfort food, a movie that feels as warm and welcoming as a Thanksgiving feast. It expertly navigates that fine line between, laugh out loud comedy and this poignant drama, never letting one, overshadow the other. Um, and also it's a tribute to that comedic alchemy of Martin and Candy here, Steve Martin and John Candy. It's a career highlight for John Hughes and just a timeless reminder that the journey is often more important than the destination. And it teaches us that even after the planes are grounded, the trains are broken down, the cars burst into flames, um, a little kindness and understanding can get you exactly where you need to be. Um, but yeah, I mean, this movie means so much to me. Um, and I know it means a lot to my wife, Candace, because it was a movie that she shared a love for with her dad. Um, and here in about 10 days, I think now, um, it'll be 2 years since my father-in-law Carl passed away, and he was a huge fan of this movie. So I wanted to mention that, as just as a tribute to him, and just talk about this movie. And like, I knew this movie for so long, but he was the one that truly showed me like how great this movie is. And I always loved watching it with him. I know Candace, that being her dad, she always loved watching it with him. So you know it's tough nowadays when I watch this movie knowing that I can't watch that with him anymore, and just see him and hear him laugh, about all the different parts of the movie. Um, but yeah, this one was for you, Carl. And anybody that's never seen Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, please get on that. Because it is one of the greatest holiday movies, 80s movies, whatever category you want to put it in. It's one of the greatest movies ever. Um, so don't hesitate to watch that. So moving on now, to the next film. And we just talked about John Hughes and how he did Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and it's wild to think that he has his name attached to not one but two Thanksgiving themed road trip movies. Um, and while Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is rightly regarded as this untouchable holiday classic, it has this scrappier, less celebrated, cousin, I like to call it, which is the movie Dutch from 1991. And this movie often gets left out in the cold. And this was another, actually, I tell you, I was just talking about my father-in-law Carl and how much he loved Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Well, he also loved this movie too, and he was actually the one who introduced me to this movie several years back. Um, and this is another one that we would always watch together. So, and just as as a comedy fan, I'm here to argue that this overlooked movie is that perfect Thanksgiving side dish. Maybe not the main course, but it is just a very satisfying one that deserves a place at the table with all these these mentioned Thanksgiving films. Um, so Dutch was released as driving me crazy in some markets. It's this classic, odd couple comedy built on, a foundation of just that pure class warfare. So you have Ed O'Neill, at the absolute height of, his Married with Children fame, stars as the title character Dutch Dooley, and he's this loud working class, construction guy with more heart than he does have tact. Um, and he's dating this sophisticated and recently divorced Natalie Standish, who's played by Jo Beth Williams, whose only connection to her old stuffy life is her son Doyle, which was played by a young Ethan Embry. Um, and when Natalie's snobbish ex-husband Reed, played by Christopher McDonald, who's just perfecting his kind of signature schmuck persona seen in a lot of his film roles, you know, um, Reed bails on Thanksgiving plans, and Dutch sees this as an opportunity. So he volunteers for this simple mission to drive from Chicago to Doyle's preppy Georgia boarding school and bring this boy home for the holiday to his mother. Um, and what follows is anything but simple. Doyle isn't just a kid. He is this pint-sized elitist, just this walking embodiment of privileged contempt who looks down on Dutch's cheap suit, gruff manners, and just his very existence, basically. Um, so the initial meeting sets the tone for their journey, as Doyle greets his would-be stepfather with a golf club to the shins and a BB gun blast to the groin. So this act of aggression just sparks this cross-country war of attrition. Um, the conflict isn't just physical slapstick. It's this kind of ideological battle. Dutch represents the blue collar, American dream. A man who has built his success with his hands and isn't afraid to get them dirty, of course. So, and then you have Doyle, who's just molded by his father. Believes that status is inherited, not earned. Um, so this road trip is just this kind of symphony of escalating comedic disasters. Each one chipping away at Doyle's kind of polished veneer and testing Dutch's patience. From this impromptu fireworks show that destroys Dutch's coat, to having their car demolished by a semi truck after this kind of act of pettiness from Doyle. The film barrels from one, hilarious set piece to another. And along the way, they hitch a ride with these two friendly prostitutes, one of them being played by E.G. Daly. And these girls, they promptly steal their wallets and their luggage, and they leave them stranded with nothing, basically. Um, and it's at this rock bottom that they come to, however, that, the films, um, that John Hughes, wrote this film, it's when that heart truly begins to shine here. And, this heartbreaking phone call reveals that Doyle's father lied about his business trip to Europe, and he has chose this new girlfriend to spend his time with during the holiday over his son. So this kind of betrayal, it cracks Doyle's armor a bit, and it allows Dutch's genuine, if clumsy kindness to finally seep in. And, their shared experience at this homeless shelter that they wind up at, on Thanksgiving Eve really solidifies that bond. And it teaches, Doyle this powerful lesson, in empathy and gratitude that his father never could. Um, and this was a critically panned and box office flop upon release. Um, but I think that Dutch has since found its legacy as a beloved cult classic. Just it's a very quintessential early '90s comfort food movie. Just kept alive by home video and years of cable television reruns. But somehow I missed out on all that for years and years. And it's like, this is such a great movie. It says such a wonderful message. You know, it, it may lack that kind of sophisticated wit, and that emotional gut punch that Planes, Trains, and Automobiles gives, but I think its impact is undeniable for those who grew up with it. And even people like me, it definitely has that impact on me, even though I've not known it as long as some people who grew up with it. I think that this film is just a perfect vehicle for Ed O'Neill, and it allows him to kind of flex that charm of Al Bundy, but infuse it with this kind of paternal warmth and this kind of underlying decency. Um, Ethan Embry, at such a young age, gives this remarkable performance as well. And just it's so believable. This transition from this insufferable, brat to just a genuinely sympathetic kid. Um, their chemistry here is really that engine, of the whole film. And it just really makes their journey from these sworn enemies to this kind of makeshift family. It makes it feel earned and very heartwarming. Um, but in conclusion, Dutch is a imperfect, but deeply charming film. It's a road trip comedy that successfully blends, that broad slapstick with just a sincere story, about found family and respect, and just realizing that the people who show up for you are more important than those who share your bloodline. Um, and, if Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is the perfectly roasted Thanksgiving turkey, then Dutch is that delicious, slightly messy stuffing that you can't get enough of. For that's a weird comparison, but I had to throw some kind of Thanksgiving lingo in there. But for any comedy fan looking forward, that alternative holiday watch, this movie is funny. It's a heartfelt journey. It's absolutely worth taking. Um, Definitely go watch this movie. If you love Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, watch Dutch as a double feature with that movie this holiday season. You won't regret it. Um, so moving on, a couple of years later, as the leaves would turn and the scent of turkey and pumpkin spice would fill the air once again in the year of 1993, comedy movie fans like myself would begin that annual ritual, as I have for years, much like other people do, of that perfect Thanksgiving movie marathon. Um, so, like I said, while classics like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles will always top the list, this next film, like I said, from 1993, is another one that is definitely towards the top of that list of Thanksgiving comedy movies. This one is a more eccentric film that's kind of, earned its, permanent place in my kind of Thanksgiving holiday rotation every year, and that's the 1993 Pauly Shore masterpiece, Son-in-Law. And for many, it's a nostalgic slice of that '90s absurdity, But for those in the know, it's a surprisingly heartwarming and genuinely funny Thanksgiving story that just perfectly captures that chaos and that ultimate warmth of the holiday. Um, so Son-in-Law is this classic fish out of water comedy, which is supercharged with just that unique spastic energy of its star. Um, the story follows Rebecca Warner, who's played by this charming Carla Gugino, um, and Becca is this sweet, intelligent farm girl from South Dakota who heads off to college out in Los Angeles, and just overwhelmed by the culture shock. She's about to just pack it all in, and head home until her dorm's resident advisor, Crawl, or Fred Weasel, also known as Crawl, played by Pauly Shore, convinces her to embrace this California lifestyle. Um, so fast forward a few months, and Becca has transformed from farm fresh to this LA chick. Just learning that Crawl has nowhere to go for Thanksgiving break. So she invites him home to experience this traditional, Midwestern holiday. Um, and this is where the comedic genius of the film begins. So that arrival, the neon clad, slang, spewing Crawl is just the heart, of this conservative farmland, and is a spectacle of just, clashing cultures. Um, so Becca's stern father, Walter, played by the brilliant Lane Smith, and then her gentle mother, Connie, and also her possessive towny boyfriend, Travis, are just utterly horrified. And to escape this unwanted proposal from Travis, Becca panics and leading Crawl to blurt out that they are already engaged. And so this whole lie sets the stage for the rest of the film, um, just forcing Crawl to prove himself, as this worthy, future son-in-law. Um, and what follows is just a series of just hilarious set pieces, where Crawl attempts to adapt to farm life from driving this this harvester to milking a cow, and all while slowly but surely winning over that the skeptical family with his just his surprisingly good heart, and that unwavering loyalty to Becca. Um, and critically, Son-in-Law was met with a lukewarm reception upon its release. But its box office success, and that you know the cult status, the cult classic status that would follow, really tells a different story. Its legacy is kind of twofold. First and foremost, it stands as just that kind of absolute zenith of Pauly Shore's, you know, the Weasel persona. This was peak Pauly Shore mania. um, just where his unique brand of that surfer dude slang, like buddy and whizzing the juice, and just the whole rubber faced antics, much like Jim Carrey would do. Um, it really, captivated this whole generation. Not just this film, but films like Encino Man and Biodome, and Jury Duty, and In the Army Now. Just so many classics from Pauly Shore. And just the role of Crawl in Son-in-Law was tailor made for him. Just allowing his character to be both this agent of chaos and this genuinely likable hero. Um, the film is a perfect time capsule, I believe, of that early 90s pop culture, from the fashion to the lingo, and just forever presenting that kind of fleeting moment when Pauly Shore was a bona fide movie star. Some people would, that weren't around at the time and that knows who Pauly Shore is, be like, what? Pauly Shore was a huge movie star? Yeah, he was. Like, you guys have no idea. Like, if you weren't around, in the world at that time, um, then you wouldn't understand like how big of a star that he was. And second, and perhaps more importantly, son-in-law has become this unofficial, Thanksgiving staple. Um, while it may not have that emotional weight of other holiday films, it fully embraces, just the core themes of the season, it's just family, acceptance, and just, bridging divides. The entire story is built around the Thanksgiving holiday. And it culminates in this dinner scene where truths are revealed and villains are vanquished with a karate kick, no less. And the fractured family unit comes together, and you have Crawl's journey from this outsider to this cherished member of the Warner family is just it's very heartwarming to see, and even if it is deeply silly, the story about looking past that surface level differences to find common ground is brilliant, I think, and it's very, very heartwarming. But the film reminds us that sometimes the most disruptive guest can be the one who brings everyone closer together. Um, and for any comedy fan, Son-in-Law is more than just a guilty pleasure. It's a comfort food movie again, like much like how Dutch or Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is. That just delivers consistent laughs and just a surprising amount of heart. The chemistry between Pauly Shore and Lane Smith here is just comedic gold. And just the supporting cast really brings the film to with its genuine charm. It's a movie that understands that families are weird. Holidays are stressful, and sometimes the best way to deal with it all is just to kind of embrace that absurd. Um, so this year, as you guys were having your Thanksgiving feast here recently, and going forward in the years to come, around this time of year, consider adding this 90s gem, to your watch list. It's a hilarious, good-natured reminder that even the oddest traditions and sons-in-laws um, can become a beloved part of the family. And you know, I I've witnessed that firsthand over the past 15 years, as I've become part of Candace's family. And then Candace has become a part, of my immediate family. Um, so, you know, sometimes it's scary when, going into being with someone and becoming part of their family or they become part of yours. You don't always know if you're going to be, accepted into their traditions or their, what they do have done for years as a family. But um, it's always wonderful when all that comes together and and that acceptance is, in place and just, and you love them, they love you, and just and you just become a part of that family. And I can honestly say, like, as being the son-in-law to Carl and Dolores, even though Carl isn't here with us anymore. Um, I've made such amazing memories with Candace's family over the years. Um, her brother CJ, even though he's my brother-in-law, he is like a real brother to me. I'm that close to him. I'm close to her entire family, and this movie, Son-in-Law, is one that we absolutely all love, and we have shared just a fondness for years and years, and we definitely will for more years to come. Um, so yeah, definitely check out Son-in-Law. Check out any of other Pauly Shore's movies too. Um, yeah, let's move forward now with as we kind of transition. So we've talked about some horror movies. We've talked about some comedy movies. So let's kind of transition into that blend that, as a lot of you know, that I love. One of my favorite, subgenres out of any genre movie, and that's horror comedies. So with this next movie, and like I said, as a connoisseur of both things that go bump in the night and things that make you laugh until you cry, I've always believed that true sweet spot in movies, lies at that intersection of horror and comedy. It's a delicate balance, one where a film can celebrate the macabre while simultaneously you know, winking at its own absurdity. So few films, have really achieved this balance as flawlessly as Barry Sonnenfeld's 1993 masterpiece, Addams Family Values. And while the first film, successfully, reintroduced this creepy, kooky family to a new generation in the 90s, this sequel is a rare case where the follow up not only, in my opinion, surpasses the original, but perfects its formula, delivering this kind of deliciously dark satire that remains as sharp and hilarious today as it was 3 decades ago. Um, so Adam's Family Values, elevates everything that worked in the first film by injecting this stronger, more coherent story, which is written by with this venomous wit by Paul Rudnick, and the plot masterfully splits into two gothic threads here. So the first sees, the arrival of this new Adams baby, Pubert, who's adorable mustached face immediately inspires his older siblings, Wednesday and Pugsley, here played by Christina Ricci and Jimmy Workman, to embark on this series of inventive, although unsuccessful, attempts on Pubert's life. um, so this sibling rivalry prompts Gomez, who's played by the magnificent Raul Julia, and then Morticia, here by the elegant Angelica Houston. It prompts them to hire this nanny. So enter Debbie, who is just an amazing performance from John Cusack, or John Cusack, Joan Cusack, which is John's sister. So can you imagine if John Cusack played Debbie in this? Be That'd be even weirder than what it already is. But anyway, so Debbie, played by Joan Cusack, who's this seemingly perfect caregiver, who is in reality, a notorious, Black Widow serial killer, just with her sights set on the family fortune. Um, from because of the wonderfully gullible Uncle Fester, played by Christopher Lloyd. Um, so the second thing here, and arguably most iconic, um, the plot line sees a suspicious Wednesday, and her little brother Pugsley, exiled to Camp Chippewa. This pastel colored nightmare of forced cheerfulness. And here, amongst the privileged and the painfully, you know, perky campers here, the Addams children stand as these kind of monochrome monuments to, individuality, just finding this kindred spirit only in the allergy ridden Joe Glicker, played by I think the guy's name is David Krumholtz or something like that. So it's this summer camp subplot that really culminates, in the film's piece de resistance, which is a Thanksgiving play that skewers American history with just this gleeful anarchic delight. Um, and for any fan of, dark humor, Wednesday Addams's, reluctant participation in Camp Chippewa's Thanksgiving play, which is a turkey named Brotherhood, is the stuff of legend here. So, she's forced into the role of Pocahontas, and she stands, opposite this preppy blonde Amanda Buckman, played by a very young Mercedes McNabb, which you may, if you're a Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan, you may recognize her, Mercedes McNabb, from that series. And like I said, she plays Amanda Buckman, as the play's lead pilgrim, Sarah Miller. Um, the This scene is just a masterclass in just that comedic buildup and its explosive payoff. So, after being brainwashed with these wholesome Disney movies in the Harmony Hut, um, Wednesday, she plays along and she acts like she's going to cooperate with them, and with these bubbly camp counselors, who are played, perfectly by Peter McNichol and Christine Baranski, into this false sense of security. Um, so when the moment comes, she doesn't just go off script; she hijacks the entire production. With her, her signature, just deadpan delivery. She delivers this chilling, historically accurate monologue about, the plight of the indigenous people. A speech that just flips the whole sanitized holiday narrative on its head, and by saying, you have taken the land which is rightfully ours, and as these other, outcast children dressed, and as their own tribe, they rise up with her, and she says, years from now, my people will be forced to live in mobile homes on reservations. Your people will wear cardigans and drink highballs. And what follows is not just a disruption, but this full-blown revolution. um, the pilgrim village is set ablaze here. The counselors are captured, and just chaos reigns. Um, from a horror perspective, it's a beautifully staged massacre of these wholesome platitudes. From a comedic one, is a perfectly executed act of this satirical defiance that remains, I think, one of the most brilliant critiques of Thanksgiving ever put to film. Um, but the enduring legacy of Addams Family Values is again, like many films I've spoke of, is multifaceted. Just first and foremost, it cemented Christina Ricci's Wednesday as this gothic icon. And as I've stated before, on here, I had the biggest crush on Christina Ricci growing up. I mean, I was in love with this girl, and um, I think really, like, it began with her role as Wednesday Addams, and it's really what kind of drew me into the whole goth culture too, to begin with. Um, I mean, I was already into like horror movies and stuff, but like really the whole goth culture as a separate entity was just a whole other thing for me. And and it's really so crazy to see like how influential the goth culture is, to this day. It's almost become like a very popular trend in the past few years, and I think a lot of that has to do with, just different thing with horror becoming a big mainstream thing again with like the Scream movies and the Terrifier movies, and then you have the Wednesday TV show with Jenna Ortega, and you see more and more of the new generation getting into like the stuff with Beetlejuice and Elvira, and just goth culture has been striving here the past several years. So and like I said, that my main introduction to that was with the Addams family and with my crush on Christina Ricci as Wednesday Addams. And like I said, she's just become this gothic icon for an entire generation. Her performance is just um, a masterwork of just understated, rebellion, and just delivering just that every venom laced line with just a chillingly calm demeanor that makes her, the film's dark beating heart, I believe. Um, similarly, Joan Cusack's Debbie is this unforgettable villain for the film. Just this, she's this gleefully sociopathic Barbie doll, basically, who's campy, manic energy really provides that perfect foil, for the Adams's stoic, morbidness. Um, and just her slideshow presentation at the end of the film, explaining her homicidal past is a comedic highlight. I think that is both horrifying and hysterically funny. Um, the film's impact also lies in that sophisticated, quotable script that it has. Rudnick's dialogue is just a treasure trove of that, these morbid one-liners that feel both timeless and daringly specific. It's a family film that trusts its audience to appreciate dark subject matters, from murder and greed to cultural appropriation, without ever feeling preachy at all. You know, it's also this kind of poignant showcase for the late Raw Julia, whose portrayal of Gomez is just this kind of whirlwind of passionate and romantic zeal. And I honestly feel that Raw Julia was the best Gomez in Addams Family history. Because the TV show, the movies, whatever. I feel like Raw Julia was Gomez Addams. And his love for Morticia is the film's anchor here. Just a reminder that this is a story about a family that, despite its unconventional methods, they love each other fiercely. Um, and Adam's Family Values is more than just a great sequel. It's a near perfect horror comedy that has only grown more and more loved by me with time, and just not just me, but so many people in this world who are fans of the whole Addams Family franchise. It's a celebration of that of the outcast, and just with a razor sharp satire and just a deeply funny film that really finds its humor in the darkest corners of life and death. And the Thanksgiving play alone really secures its place in just that world of great comedy scenes. I feel because it offers this very cathartic and just hilarious takedown of sanitized history. It's a film that proves that true family values aren't about conforming to the norms of society, but about embracing your own wonderfully weird and dark and kooky nature. um for that, I think we should all be eternally thankful. And definitely, all, if you haven't done it in the past, from now on, add Adam's Family Values to your Thanksgiving movie marathon every year from here on out. It's definitely one of my favorites to watch. I mean, though, like the Thanksgiving portion of it is very minimal, and it's kind of just very specific with Wednesday and Pugsley's situation. Um, it's always on that rotation for me for my Thanksgiving movies, just because of that whole segment alone. Um, so yeah, definitely check out Addams Family Values and just watch anything Addams Family related while you're at it. Why not? Um, but this next movie or next couple movies, I guess I want to talk about these next couple movies together. And these were brand new watches for me. This year, and so I've known about these movies for several years now. I've heard a lot of people talk about these movies, um, and I thought it was finally time for me to sit down and watch these movies. So, in the realm of low budget, offbeat horror comedies, um, there are few films like these movies. Um, and but these movies have achieved this cult following, um, surprisingly. Um, and this is the Thankskilling series. So there's only two movies in the Thankskilling series, and these two amateurish yet spirited movies. Um, Kind of delve into that dark humor of this demonically possessed turkey, on this vengeful rampage against, um, white people around Thanksgiving. Um, and just as a horror and comedy, enthusiast, I there was a lot of points within these films that I thoroughly enjoyed. I mean, there's a lot of that delirious campiness and that you know um, that I love in so many of these ridiculously silly movies. Um, and Thanksgiving, being that traditionally family oriented holiday, really provides this dark backdrop for these campy slasher films. Um, and so Jordan Downey's Thankskilling, which was made for a mere $3,500, initially received a lot of unfavorable reviews. But like I said, it has surprisingly over the years garnered this devoted fan base. I've realized. So in Thankskilling, the story begins, centuries ago, during the first Thanksgiving in 1621, and the movie starts out with this topless pilgrim girl running through these woods and is, brutally murdered by this demonic evil turkey named Turkey, uh, who was, awakened by this outraged Native American shaman after being desecrated by this pilgrim ancestor. So the story then shifts to this modern day, college students, Kristen, Johnny, Billy, Allie, and Darren, who are terrorized by Turkey as they head home for the holiday. And Turkey, like I said, seeking revenge on all these white people, possesses and kills off, each of Kristen's friends one by one in this gruesome kind of humorous in these humorous ways. First it's Johnny's, estranged father, followed by Allie during this kind of sex encounter with her boyfriend Greg. And when Kristen, and the remaining survivors attempt to seek help, from her father, who's the local sheriff, uh, Turkey poses as him as taking the skin of his face and like wearing it basically like leather face, and that's where the whole like absurdness of this film has one of its high points of the absurdness, I should say. Whereas it's obviously this turkey wearing the skin of her father's face, but the characters are too dumb to realize that, or I know that's just a part of the story, but it's pretty ridiculous. So the group discovers the only way to defeat Turkey is to remove his magic talisman and burn him at the stake. Um, just reciting this backward demonic prayer. However, their victory is short lived when Turkey's mangled body is then thrown into this radioactive dumpster and it reanimates him. And in the end, Kristen has to defend herself and Johnny, and they slay Turkey once and for all, or so she thought. So, Thankskilling, the next movie, Thankskilling 3, um, picks up where the first movie left off. Showcasing Turkey's lingering presence as this vengeful force. The movie jumps through this kind of series of absurd scenarios, featuring these just bizarre and ridiculous characters, aiding Turkey and his quest for the last copy of Thankskilling 2, which is the whole joke is why it jumps the movie series jumps from Thankskilling to Thankskilling 3. And this movie includes, a rapping granny, this mindless puppet, just a wig wearing inventor, and this bisexual space worm. Um, and I'm not going to go too much into these movies, but this, if you're at all interested, these movies are for free on Tubi, and you just have to see to believe what I'm talking about. Um, and Thanksgiving 3, much like the first film, is this, it's delirious and just over the top through that kind of lowbrow horror comedy. Um, and in the Thanksgiving series, is has this commitment to that offbeat humor and that campy charm, and it's like I said, it has carved out this kind of unique niche in modern horror culture. It does have a fan base out there. Um, just the film's low budget, kind of DIY aesthetic, you know, in a way adds to that its own charm, and so even though these are not movies I'll probably ever watch again, like I said, there were several things about them that I was entertained by, and I think it definitely makes films be seen as this kind of staple that amateurish yet oddly entertaining horror comedies out there. Um, and while I said like the initial reception was largely negative, um, it has that this somewhat small loyal fan base out there, who appreciate that its willingness, I guess, to push boundaries. Um, these films have, from what I've seen, inspired a lot of fan art and even some cosplay out there, and music tributes. Uh, and it just so it's kind of further cemented its place in the subculture of a lot of horror enthusiasts. Um, but in conclusion, like I said, I wanted to keep this short on these films because honestly, there's not a whole lot to talk about with these films. The first film itself is like an hour and 7 minutes long, so it's not. So if you at least want to just watch that one, it's not a long movie at all. But these movies are honestly, in a way, just a match made in B movie heaven. Um, they offer this kind of delightful blend of dark humor and just absurdity. While they may not be everyone's taste, I think that these films do still have like a testament, to the power of creativity and just that camp in horror comedy. Um, and as me myself as a fan of the genre, you know, um, I think that I would, like I said, I would recommend watching these movies at least once just to kind of, garner your own opinion on it. They may not be something I would ever watch again, but like I did say, I was at least entertained by a bit of the content that was in these movies. And so just be prepared for a healthy dose of blood and gore and just complete fucking nonsense. But weirdly in a good way. Yeah, like I said, these movies are on Tubi for free. If you guys want to watch them, they are there. Uh, but moving on to the next movie. So this next movie, this was just released a couple years ago, and I like I said, as a seasoned horror fan, I've endured my fair share of jump scares and cheesy one-liners, and these creatively dispatched characters such as Turkey from Thankskilling. Um, but for us, on all seriousness though, when the buzz surrounding Eli Ross Thanksgiving started to kind of be everywhere, a few years ago, um, you know, I I was super excited, but I'd never watched it, even when it was released, back a couple of years ago. And I was reading everything about it. I was super pumped to watch it, but I don't know, like for some reason, I never got around to watching it until this year. So this year when I decided to watch this movie for my 500 movies in 2025, I was absolutely delighted. After what completing this film, just it was to see another holiday slasher, be released, especially one around Thanksgiving. Um, I can confidently say that this movie Thanksgiving really delivers. It proves itself as this worthy addition to the horror canon, especially for those who like me find that morbid delight in holiday horror. Um, so Thanksgiving is the full length feature which was born from this hilarious and just gory fake trailer that first graced us in Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez's 2007 anthology film Grindhouse. Sorry guys, it's getting late. I'm slurring my words here. Uh, this this isn't just a cash in, with this movie. It's a lovingly crafted homage to the slasher films of the past. Particularly the ones that weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. And like I said, this was directed by Eli Roth, who's a filmmaker who's known for his kind of often controversial style, like Cabin Fever and Hostel, Green Inferno, and so forth. Um, and this was written by Eli Roth himself alongside Jeff Rendell, and the film plunges us into this seemingly idyllic town of Plymouth, Massachusetts. And the story kicks off on Thanksgiving, where this Black Friday riot outside the local superstore, Right Mart, escalates into this tragic bloodbath. And the ensuing chaos, fueled by consumer desperation, claims several lives, including Amanda Collins, who's the wife of the store's manager, Mitch. And a year later, as Plymouth braces itself for another Black Friday, this silent, imposing figure emerges from the shadows. And he's clad in this disturbingly stoic pilgrim mask and hat. And this killer is dubbed John Carver. And it just begins systematically targeting those involved in the previous year's deadly incident. Um, so the movie masterfully weaves this tale of revenge, with John Carver's victims being those responsible directly or indirectly for the deaths that occurred during the Right Mart stampede 1 year prior to this. um, And the plot follows Jessica Wright, played by Addison Rae, who is the daughter of the Wright Mart owner. And her group of friends, as they find themselves, squarely in the killer's crosshairs. Sheriff, Eric Newland, played by Patrick Dempsey here, attempts to maintain order and uncover the identity of John Carver. But this masked menace, proves elusive and just terrifyingly efficient. And what unfolds, is this tense, like cat and mouse, game punctuated by, inventive and gruesome kills that, pay homage to, the slasher themes while adding this kind of fresh, bloody spin to it all. Um, the film's pacing is brisk, keeping the audience, on the edge of their seats. And that final act delivers this very shocking twist that kind of recontextualizes, much of everything that you'd already seen in the film, especially all of the violence. Um, and while Thanksgiving is a relatively new film, its legacy and impact are, already beginning to start to take shape, particularly within, the horror community. Um, this was the resurrection of the holiday slasher. For years, the holiday slasher subgenre has felt a bit, dormant, I guess you could say, with notable exceptions being, the Scream franchise and, a few other sporadic attempts. Um, Thanksgiving has, with its vibrant and brutal execution, reignited interest in this niche of horror. It proves that there is still an appetite for holiday themed terror, offering this fresh, modern take on a classic concept. And just the film's direct lineage from the Grindhouse trailer is a significant part of its legacy. It's a testament to the enduring power of those, fake trailers, just demonstrating that a well crafted, concept can indeed be brought to life. um, and just this success might encourage, further development of other grindhouse trailer ideas, and just creating this kind of potential mini anthology movement within modern horror. Um, and this was also Eli Roth's return to form, I think for some at least, just it, following this period of just that very, directorial efforts, Thanksgiving really marked this strong return for Eli Roth to this kind of, splatter filled, um, high octane horror that really, initially put him on the map with films like I mentioned earlier, like Hostel and Cabin Fever. And, for fans who appreciate his, approach to violence and horror, this film really feels like a triumphant resurgence for him. Um, and let's talk about the killer himself, John Carver. I think this is a modern slasher icon in the making. That character of John Carver with just that distinctive mask and just that ruthless efficiency really has the potential to become this memorable, slasher villain. Um, his motivations rooted in this tragic event, and this twisted, sense of justice really adds a layer of depth that can resonate, with audiences and just potentially, spawn future installments. Um, so the fact that Thanksgiving received, generally positive reviews from critics, and achieved this respectable, box office performance, $46 million worldwide against this, $15 million budget. It really indicates that this positive, market impact, and this success really signals to studios that there is a viable audience for, these well executed R-rated slasher films. Um, you know, and then like I said, with this movie kind of, potentially spawning future installments, there is already just a, talk of a sequel. There was an announcement for the sequel, and this, because of that direct impact, of the film's kind of positive reception. So this ensures that continued presence of the Thanksgiving story, and its characters, within the horror landscape, and it solidifies its place. I think is more than just a one-off event. Um, and then to look at like the film's creative kills and its blend of just modern social commentary, with Black Friday Riot being the catalyst for it all, with just those traditional slasher elements could really influence a lot of future horror filmmakers. Just the way it addresses consumerism and that mob mentality, before kind of diving into that visceral horror, is just a very compelling, narrative touch, I believe. Um, and for horror fans, the film really offered this satisfying blend of nostalgia and that contemporary filmmaking. It provided the kind of gore and suspense and just these character types that that slasher enthusiasts crave, just really fostering this strong fan engagement, and just this discussions online within horror communities. And the film taps into the that collective desire for this cathartic release through extreme scenarios, and just providing just a thrilling cinematic experience, I think. um, so Thanksgiving is a horror film that just understands its audience. It's a blood soaked love letter to the slasher genre. Just packed with suspense and creative kills, and just surprising amount of story coherence. Eli Roth here has crafted a film that is both a loving homage and a fresh take, proving that even a holiday as seemingly wholesome as Thanksgiving can be this fertile ground for terror. And as a horror fan who appreciates a good scare and a healthy dose of gore, Thanksgiving delivered beyond my expectations. It's a film that doesn't shy away, from its R rating, um, embracing just the visceral thrills that make slashers so enduringly popular. So gather your friends and prepare for a Thanksgiving feast that is anything but traditional. It's a bloody, glorious cinematic experience. Um, and if this series does continue, um, I'm definitely going to not wait to watch that next entry in the franchise. I want to watch that as soon as that is released. So bravo, Eli Roth. I've given this man shit for many years because I hate the Hostel films, and I felt like the only thing that I really enjoyed that he worked on, um, was Cabin Fever. And after that came out, and then the Hostel films were released, I was just never really a fan of this guy anymore. But with watching Thanksgiving, I think this really has resurged his career as a filmmaker, and I look forward to what's next. So bravo, Eli Roth. Um, and now that brings me to the last movie I want to talk about here on the CraterMania Thanksgiving special. Um, so this one isn't really a Thanksgiving movie. Although, but it does take place around the Thanksgiving holiday. Whereas we just talked about the Black Friday riot, in the movie Thanksgiving. As many people know around the world, Black Friday is the one of the craziest shopping days of the year, as it is the day after Thanksgiving every year. And this last movie that I'm going to talk about tonight definitely celebrates that. As I'm going to be talking about Black Friday from 2021. And as a devoted horror fan and a also a lifelong fan of the legend himself, Bruce Campbell, I approach any new project that he's involved in with kind of this mixture of giddy excitement and kind of cautious optimism, because you never know like what shitty project he's going to be a part of at some point in his career. Um, and just the premise of Black Friday from 2021 is it's a creature feature set during the consumerist chaos of this year's biggest shopping day, uh, biggest and craziest shopping day. And it just this movie felt like a match made in B movie heaven for real. Um, Thankfully, the film largely delivers on its promise, serving, up a fun, gory, and refreshingly, straightforward horror movie that knows exactly what it is, and it has a blast doing it. Um, so this movie was directed by Casey Tebow, and Black Friday centers on just these employees of this massive toy store, We Love Toys, as they're preparing for this Thanksgiving night rush. Um, because several for several years, um, they did they moved Black Friday instead of actual Friday till to the evening of Thanksgiving Day. Um, and I've been to Black Friday sales at stores several times, and it's insanity. I mean, just go on YouTube and search Black Friday, and just or Black Friday chaos or carnage or violence or anything within the lines of just with Black Friday in the title on YouTube, and you will find some crazy shit that captured on film at these stores. And I'm not talking about movies or anything from a TV show. I'm talking about real footage, real life footage of just people that are insane. So, um, with this movie Black Friday, though, just the cast of a who's who of genre favorites are in this film, and it's led by Devin Sawa as Ken, who's this washed up dad, just trying to get through his shift, and he's joined by these group of retail warriors, including a guy named Chris, played by Ryan Lee. You have this girl named Marnie, who's played by Ivana Baquero, and also Michael J. White as this germophobic maintenance man. But presiding over this motley crew is the jaded, sarcastic store manager Jonathan Wexler, who is played with that pitch perfect weariness by Bruce Campbell. And their night goes from bad to worse. When the shoppers already, feral in their pursuit of these deals, they begin succumbing to this mysterious, parasitic alien organism. And the infection, spreads rapidly, turning customers into these grotesque, slobbering creatures that are just hell bent on assimilating everyone in the store. And what follows is this classic, siege narrative. The employees must barricade themselves inside and find a way to survive, the ever growing horde, and just figure out how, to escape this retail prison that has, become their potential tomb. So the film smartly blends, this gooey practical effects with action and comedy, and just really creates this tone reminiscent of 80s creature features like The Blob or Night of the Creeps. And while this is still a relatively recent film, um, Black Friday has already kind of from what I can see, has carved out this kind of comfortable niche for itself. Its primary legacy is this stellar, entry in, two beloved horror subgenres, holiday horror and retail horror. And if you're paying attention to me on my channel, you know that it stands proudly alongside my favorite horror film of all time. That's George Romero's Dawn of the Dead. Just kind of using that backdrop, of this shopping center to satirize, mindless consumerism. And however, where Romero's masterpiece was this kind of grim allegory, Black Friday kind of leans into the absurdity of it all, using comedy to underscore just the horror of the situation. Um, it's a modern cult classic, I think, in the making. Just I think it's destined for that annual Thanksgiving week viewings for horror fans, looking for an alternative to festive cheer. And I absolutely love this one. For fans of Bruce Campbell, this film's impact is significant. It's a joy just to see him in this, substantial role that really feels tailor made for his talents. And, he isn't the wisecracking, chainsaw wielding hero. Instead, he embodies the tired, cynical manager who has just seen it all and is utterly unimpressed by, this apocalypse that's unfolding, in his store. Um, just his deadpan delivery that he's so well known for, just provides many of the film's best laughs, and just his presence as both, an actor and a producer, you know, lends the project just this kind of air of genre credibility. This isn't just a cameo. Bruce Campbell is a core part of the ensemble here, and his performance is, definitely, this welcome reminder of just his comedic timing and screen presence, outside of the Evil Dead universe. Um, but Black Friday is an unpretentious and immensely entertaining creature feature. It doesn't reinvent the wheel by any means, but it rolls along with confidence, just propelled by this fantastic cast, and impressive practical monster effects, and just, this simple, effective premise. Devon Sawa makes for a compelling and relatable lead, and just the entire, supporting cast feels, authentic in their kind of shared retail misery, which I'm very familiar with myself. But for horror fans, it's a bloody good time that just delivers, the gore and the laughs that you'd expect. And for Bruce Campbell fans, I think this is an essential watch. That just really showcases, the man doing what he does best, and that's, facing down these otherworldly horrors with just a world weary sigh and just a perfectly timed, sarcastic remark. So if you're looking for, a gory, funny, and action packed film, to add to that holiday rotation year in and year out, then go right ahead and punch your time card and give Black Friday a watch. But, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for the CraterMania Thanksgiving special. Um, I want to thank everyone who either watched this live, or if you're watching this on replay. Thank you guys so much. Um, I hope that every one of you guys had a wonderful holiday, a wonderful Thanksgiving, a wonderful time shopping during Black Friday. Tomorrow is Cyber Monday, so if you guys want to continue that shopping and spend some more money, I'm sure there will be some deals all over the place online tomorrow. But drop me a comment below on what your favorite Thanksgiving themed movie is, whether it be one of the ones I talked about, or if there's another one out there that I did not mention on tonight's show. Let me know what that is. I'd love to talk to you about it. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button to catch more videos from me like this one. And as always, click that bell for any future notifications. So, as I stated at the beginning of this show, this was the end of November, and I had to do this. Even though I was a little bit late on it, I still had to do this by the end of November by putting out this Thanksgiving special, talking about all these movies. I had a blast talking about them tonight. But if you're watching this live right now, you will see that my time is 1:21 a.m. Eastern time. So it is now officially December 1st. And over the next month, we are closing out this journey of the 500 movies in 2025. There's 1 month left, ladies and gentlemen, of the 500 movies in 2025. And I've still got a little bit to go, but we're going to close this last month of the year outright by talking about tons and tons and tons of Christmas themed movies almost all month long until we get to the very end. And at the very end of this month, we're going to be doing some New Year's themed movies. So this is going to be a hell of a month. We're going to be talking about some great movies, some that I may have never even seen before. And it's just going to be a whole lot of holiday themed fun. And we are this close, ladies and gentlemen, to the very end of this journey of getting to those 500 movies in 2025. But with all that said, I'm Crater. This is CraterMania. I love you guys, and have a good night.